about the team who's going to join us today to share about their work. So I'm really honored to introduce Dr. Chris Montecillo Leider, who is a teacher educator and education researcher. Her work focuses on teacher beliefs about language diversity, anti-racist pedagogical practices, and policy and civil rights issues regarding teacher education and racialized multilingual learners' access to education. She also uses critical collaborative ethnographic methods to unpack, make visible, and center the lived experiences of women of color educators and scholars. And Chris is the elected president of MATSOL and a member of the National Committee for Effective Literacy for Multilingual Learners. Her experiences growing up as a Filipina American and second-generation immigrant in Southeast Alaska, as well as her professional experiences teaching English and Spanish and working in predominantly white institutions, have shaped both her research agenda and approach to teacher education. Also want to welcome Dr. Christina Dobbs, an associate professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning in the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. She's also the program director for the English Education for Equity and Justice program and holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Language and Literacy. Her research focuses on the language diversity, the language of school, critical consciousness, and disciplinary literacy training and professional development of teachers. Her research can be found in a variety of journals, including Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, Reading Research Quarterly, Reading and Writing, Professional Development and Education, and Journal of School Leadership. She's an author of the books Investigating Disciplinary Literacy and Disciplinary Literacy Inquiry and Instruction, and an editor of the book Humanizing Education, Critical Alternatives to Reform. She's from rural Texas and a former high school English teacher and reading specialist. So with that introduction, you can hear why we're so excited to have Chris and Christina share their work today. They bring a wealth of experience and heart in the classroom, advocating for multilingual learners, the students we serve. I'm going to hand it over to you and just want to mention that if you have questions throughout the presentation, please share them in the chat and we will have time for Q&A at the end. We'll try to serve up as many questions as we can. So Chris and Christina, thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, which is also the busiest time of the semester, and I'm sure many of us on here are also still suffering from a little bit of an AERA hangover. Really happy that you're here to join us. We're here to share up a little bit about some pilot work we've been doing around understanding teachers' views on linguistic diversity, the relationship between beliefs about language learning and sociopolitical beliefs about language. Again, I'm Chris Montecillo Leider, and I'm here with my colleague Christina Dobbs, who's actually going to kick us off to start.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Just to give a quick overview, Chris, you can click. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say beliefs about language. We have a pretty substantial body of research about people who are explicitly labeled as language teachers and their beliefs, but we are thinking about all teachers because everyone teaches language and what people believe about language. We're curious about how beliefs about language have been conceptualized in the past and how we might reconceptualize the way we measure those beliefs about language. So if you want to click. We feel quite strongly that everyone should think about their positionality even when they're doing quantitative work. So we're going to introduce ourselves briefly. Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. So again, Chris Montecillo Leider, I use she, her pronouns. I'm Filipina. I grew up in Southeast Alaska. A lot of people don't know this, but there's a lot of Filipinos that live in Alaska. In my hometown in particular, the Filipino population currently makes up about 10%. Of the town and also of the school district. I used to teach ESL and Spanish. I'm currently an assistant professor of education where I primarily work with pre-service teachers. I've been thinking about beliefs for a really long time. as I mentioned, I'm Filipina. I grew up in a immigrant multilingual household. And when I was in kindergarten and went to school, my kindergarten teacher told my parents to stop using Filipino languages with me because it would impede my ability to learn to read in English. So this like belief that kind of got imparted on my parents when I was really young is something that I'm always coming back to in the work that I've done as a teacher and now as a researcher.
And I am Christina. I also use she, her pronouns. I identify as multi-ethnic very strongly as Texan, as many Texans do. I am Latina and white, which is pretty fun on all the forms that say you can be white and not Latino, and the ones that say you can be Latino, parentheses, not white. It was confusing my whole life. I grew up actually in a predominantly white household that was monolingual, and I was the only person of color who lived there. And so I've spent my whole life with people looking at my face and assuming that I speak Spanish. And I did not learn to speak Spanish until I was sitting at home during the pandemic with thinking about what I wanted to do. I'm a former English language arts teacher, and I also taught a lot of ESL, ELA classes in Houston, Texas before I became a professor. I'm also a reading specialist and a literacy coach. So I've done a lot of work thinking about changing what teachers do and thinking about what informs their practices and how they're making decisions about that. These days, I'm an associate professor in English education for equity and justice here at Wheelock, where I work primarily with students who undergraduates who think they might want to be teachers, graduate students who are going through licensure, and doctoral students in language and literacy in a variety of specializations. All right, so if we get into what we're here to talk about today, the first question is, what do we mean when we say beliefs about language and how that gets transmitted in classrooms? So there's a range of research about teacher beliefs. Beliefs and attitudes and dispositions and a whole bunch of things are conceptualized slightly differently. We use a definition of beliefs that they are a subjective, experience-based, and often implicit knowledge and emotion on some matter. So that implicit part is quite important. We sort of live in a soup here, at least in the United States, of messaging about language, what kind of language is good and bad, hard and easy, American and not American. And we know that beliefs can be conscious or unconscious ideas that teachers hold as true. We've even done a little bit of work about beliefs that shows that sometimes teachers hold contradictory beliefs about teaching and learning that they don't particularly work to resolve. When it comes to thinking about what teachers believe about culturally and linguistically diverse learners, we know a few things. We know that they hold socio-political beliefs about language and language learners. So whether you think one should speak English to be fully American, that's a socio-political sort of question about language learning. We often have some documentation that teachers can hold deficit-oriented beliefs about culturally and linguistically diverse learners and their potential. The studies show that teachers will sometimes give multilingual students less rigorous tasks, only in English, that sort of thing, and that they will name that they think multilingual kids are, quote, behind other kids in terms of their language development. There's also a set of studies about beliefs about how language is learned. I run into people constantly. I heard someone say on a podcast just today that you can't learn a language once you get too old. You have to learn it when you're young or you'll never learn. And those are the sort of beliefs about language learning that are sort of pretty implicit, but also quite present in our current culture. We know that teachers can hold inaccurate beliefs about language learning in a range of ways about when language is learned and how. And we're sort of curious about those beliefs and how they impact instruction that ultimately impacts students. So if you want to click.
Oh, whoops, sorry. I
Well,
clicked the wrong thing.
I didn't mean click that.
Give me a second.
Okay, it's coming
Whoopsie.
back. Don't worry.
Yeah, don't worry. Hold on. There it is. Okay, hold on. And here we are.
Okay, so this is from a classroom that we have visited. And this is just a poster on the wall. Being bilingual is my superpower. We'll leave it up for just a minute. And I'm curious if you want to in the chat, if anything jumps out at you as like interesting or notable, maybe you could type in the chat. So possess another soul, interesting words. Job opportunities. This must be from a classroom with Spanish English bilingual students because it says I can communicate with 437 million Spanish speakers and 1.5 billion English speakers. There's an emphasis on bilingual, not multilingual in some places. There's sort of a lot going on in this little poster of this purple guy with his yellow cape about why multilingualism, bilingualism might be a benefit. All right, click to the next one. Just to talk a little bit more about teachers' beliefs, we'll add why do they matter? So we talked about some of this before, but why do they matter? We know that teachers' beliefs impact how they understand their students and the relationships they ultimately have with those students, and they impact instructional practice. So if you think that the language, and I've actually heard a teacher say this, this is not a made up example. If you think that the language in the biology textbook is too challenging for the students that you have in your classroom to read, you might just not use that textbook for reading in the biology class, which might be supportive in the long run, because the biology books I had were not my favorite in my own growing up, but I can say I had to read them if I wanted to learn the language that was in them, because it was full of things that we don't often say to each other. So you might make that decision. You might say, okay, this is too hard, so I'm not going to use it with my students. And that's what kind of impact we're thinking about having on instructional practice. So click. Here's another poster from a classroom. Class expectation. Number 1, English only, exclamation point. Only in all capital letters. So, this is another message. What kind of language is welcome here? What kind of language is seen as sort of meeting expectations versus not? And, what kind of language will we be using to assess whether we're understanding? It seems clear that in this space, it would be English. All right, click one more time.
Yep, we got one more example of beliefs here.
So just like Chris's teachers, who I think probably meant well and maybe didn't know any different, looked at her parents. We see this happening all the time. We see multilingual kids in classrooms, and then we see teachers looking at them and thinking, okay, that person is going to have a hard time learning to read in English. And that if we emphasize monolingualism, that might make things easier. All right, so I'm going to pass it to Chris to talk a little bit about how we've been thinking about beliefs and how we might measure them.
Right. So Christina just shared a little overview from the research of different beliefs that teachers have, especially with regard to racialized multilingual learners. And we shared a couple examples of beliefs that oftentimes are like implicit, right? Like they might, or they can also be explicit, right? But those beliefs that we have, the teachers have, they often play a role in impacting the practice that they do in the classroom. And so one of the things that Christina and I have been really curious about then, okay, it's like, so we know teachers have these beliefs. We've observed them in our colleagues, with our own teachers, even in looking at ourselves. And we've started to wonder, like, how does the research look at beliefs? How are beliefs about language conceptualized? And when we look at the literature, there's a lot of different, tools and surveys and measures that exist out there to look at teacher practice, to look at various ideas around teachers' beliefs. Two typical constructs that tend to show up specifically with regard to beliefs about language are socio-political beliefs about language and then beliefs about how languages are learned. So the first, socio-political beliefs about language, there is a survey which Christina will talk about in more depth in a little bit when we talk about the present study. But it's the Language Attitudes Teacher Scale. It was developed in the early 90s by a team of educational psychologists. It's more commonly referred to as the LATs. And it's often been used with in-service teachers, in particular about their beliefs and views with regard to teaching multilingual learners. Because it was developed in the 90s, the original language has things like limited English proficient. We've updated it with our use here, but it essentially is asking these beliefs of teachers that are related to the socio-political climate. So ideas like to be considered American, one should speak English, right? Or it's important to learn a language that is not English, right? Or ideas around policy, like English should be the official language of the United States. That's an interesting one to consider right now in particular, given the recent executive order. Or things that have to do around teacher training, right? This idea that regular classroom teachers should be required to receive pre-service or in-service training to meet the needs of linguistic minorities, right? So these are all around beliefs that are really influenced by like the socio-political climate. In contrast, there's another body of work about teachers' beliefs that is specifically about how beliefs are learned. The BALI, or the Beliefs About Language Learning Inventory, that was developed in the late 80s, so it's a little bit older than the LATs. And this survey was initially developed specifically for language like world language students, at the time referred to as foreign language students, and teachers of world language, and then later adopted to be using for teachers of like ELT, English language teachers. And these questions around trying to conceptualize beliefs about language learning have to do with things like when students can carry on a conversation fluently, they don't need any special language instruction, right? So this is relating to pedagogy. Or the idea that learning a new language, it's the same as just learning other academic subjects, or even ideas related specifically to learning particular languages, like the idea that one language might be easier to learn than another, or the idea that English is maybe a very difficult language to perhaps a very easy language to learn. Right. So the field has tended to conceptualize beliefs about language from one of these two lenses, primarily using one of those two inventories. And we definitely see this conceptualization in the beliefs that we've observed in the classroom and with the teachers that we work with, right? So this idea, like that my kindergarten teacher had, that she will have a hard time learning to read in English, right? So you see this belief that heritage first, home language, that's going to negatively impact learning English, right? That's a belief about language learning, right? About the language learning process. But then we have this sign that we've seen in a classroom. Fun fact: this sign was in the same classroom that had the "Being bilingual is a superpower" poster. So I'm not totally sure what's going on there. Those are two pretty conflicting ideas. But we see here in this idea, like English only as a classroom expectation, you see both elements of beliefs about language learning, right? There's kind of this idea that perhaps maybe immersion is the best way to learn a language, right? That's why we want to speak English only, right? That might be the teacher's thought process there, right? But you also see this underlying socio-political belief about language as well, right? English is the language we should be speaking at school, right? Therefore, like we should only speak English in the classroom, right? So when we see things like this, Christina and I start to wonder, like, are those two constructs, are they entirely separate? Like what is it more complicated than that? We're really interested in trying to tease a little bit about tease that apart. So I'm going to turn it back over to Christina, who's going to talk a little bit about a pilot study that we've been doing.
All right, so we've been thinking about a sort of fuller, more multidimensional way of thinking about teachers' beliefs about language. So you can click. So this is the study we've been doing. So we have a couple of research questions at this point, which is just a pilot, so that might change. What's the relationship between teacher beliefs about language learning and sociopolitical beliefs about language? Do beliefs about language learning and sociopolitical beliefs about language vary between language teachers, which we're defining as world language teachers, teachers explicitly of multilingual students, content teachers, which we're defining as, physics teachers, algebra teachers, that sort of thing. Generalist teachers who tend to work with younger students, like elementary teachers who teach all the different subjects across a day, or intervention and specialist teachers. These are special educators, reading specialists, those sorts of folks. So far in this study, we have surveyed 194 early career teachers who are enrolled in teacher education courses, either to get their initial certification or to take coursework to keep building their knowledge base in elementary, special ed, early childhood, and secondary content teachers. We have given them a combined and slightly modified version of the BALI and the LATS, which you'll see a little bit about that in just a second. And students were asked to respond to the whole survey using the knowledge and beliefs that they had before we got into any sort of learning in our courses, which tend to be focused on supporting multilingual learners in a range of different classrooms. In terms of preliminary analysis of that data, we did a principal component analysis for the existing LATS subscales. We did this because the LATS is well established and validated. So we did PCA. We did an exploratory factor analysis for the BALI because the BALI, which while it has been widely used, has not been verified. So we used EFA there. And we did EFA to think about all the items from the LATS and the BALI and how they map onto one another. Okay, you can click.
All right, so.
Wait, it's still me. So if you look back on the survey items, you'll see they tend to be ones that are sort of strongly disagree to strongly agree, except for there is this one item on the BALI that is sort of a random outlier that is multiple choice, but also incredibly interesting. So we have kept it. English is a very difficult language, all the way to E, a very easy language. And so respondents sort of put themselves along the scale. Just a couple more things about the scales on the next slide. The LATS has 3 subscales: language, politics, and you can see it was made in the 90s. And we have updated this terminology: limited English proficiency intolerance, so like how tolerant people are of having multilingual students in classrooms, and language support. The LATS has been used a lot, and they had been cited a lot. And it is a sort of ed psych sort of measure. Its reliability estimates are 0.81, but it has mostly been used in the US with practicing teachers across grade and content levels. Okay, the BALI has 5 domains: aptitude for new languages, the difficulty of language learning, learning and communication strategies, the nature of language learning, and motivations toward learning. It has a few items that we dropped that have to do with universal grammar, because universal grammar was super interesting and very much people understood what it was in the 90s. And today, that does not appear to be the case when we ask students to respond to items before we got started. The BALI has been cited thousands of times, despite not being validated. And it is from the field of language education. So it has a slightly different orientation than the EdPsych one. It has been used all over the world, but mostly with world language and ESL, ML teachers and students. So we are using it for a slightly different purpose and with a slightly different audience, which I think is important to note. All right, now I'm done.
All right, so I'll just share a little bit about the 194 participants in our pilot study. So as Christina had mentioned earlier, we have a range from early childhood, which in Massachusetts, early childhood is one of the initial licenses you can earn. And so there are a number of universities that train specifically for that. But so from early childhood to middle and secondary content teachers, as well as interventionists, special ed, and reading specialists. And you'll see here the majority of folks that that participated in this pilot study are from middle secondary content areas over here. To do our analyses, we went ahead and combined our sample. So we combined our elementary generalists, so the elementary education focused students, and the early childhood ones. And then we have all the secondary content, which we included the traditional disciplines of math, science, social studies, ELA, and we also added the world language there. The program that we were working with used MFL, Modern Foreign Language, as their name, so that's where MFL comes from. And then we elected to do a specialist group, which included special education, reading, and ESL. Most of the ESL teachers that participated worked in middle and elementary schools who essentially did like a pull-out model. So really kind of aligned more with an interventionist approach in those schools. So for the purpose of this, we had elected to combine them in that way. There's other ways that we've played with combining the sample, but this is what we'll share today from our pilot data. Okay, so the first thing we did, because as Christina had mentioned, the LATS, which is the one about socio-political beliefs about language, is validated. We just did a principal component analysis, a PCA, to see how it would hang together for this diverse range of teachers. To our knowledge, when we've reviewed the literature, there really isn't anyone that has included such a wide range of teachers all in one pool. And so what we saw here was, you know, in the full, when you look just at the full sample, it seems to work all right for language politics and what the LEP, limited English proficiency and tolerance here. The language support, it's like, not really working here. And so we also ran an exploratory factor analysis. And what was interesting when we did this is there seemed to be a bit better fit when we did an EFA and we had 4 different subscales that emerged. And so we kind of adopted these names, subscales based on the items and how the items that hung together. But we ended up with something similar to LEP intolerance, but we're referring to as English learner intolerance. This idea of English hegemony, or, you know, that like English is the best, English is American. Ideas around language support, which is really about the pedagogy. And then this idea about government regulation and support. So those were items that had to do with providing more funding for programs that specifically served classified English learners, or that teachers should all have like a mandate for, you know, mandated training for working with multilingual learners, things like that. So then we looked at the BOLI. And it's important to remember the BOLI has never been validated, or if somebody validated it, they didn't publish it, or we couldn't find it. And we looked at a lot of stuff. It has been, if you remember from the previous table that Christina showed, it has been cited over 2,000 times across the globe. So people are here like using the BOLI out in the world in all these different ways. And really in a lot of different ways here. But so we did just an EFA to see kind of how things might hang together. It's not the best fit, as you can see here. And when we did try, so we tried really hard. We ran an exploratory factor analysis, and we're seeing what items were like kind of hanging together and trying to figure out like what was their commonalities, what were their grouping, and that was really tough to do. It kind of felt like we were almost like trying to force something. So that's where we were with the BOLI, and we have a lot of things that we're still kind of exploring with that, but I wanted to share that with you today. And then the last bit of our preliminary analyses that we wanted to share is, the thing that we're really interested in trying to understand here is, are socio-political beliefs about language and beliefs about how language is learned, like, is there a relationship? Is there an overlap, right? One of the things that like I think a lot about is, okay, if I'm a teacher and I think that learning English is easy, and I believe that immersion is the best way to learn, and I believe that it is necessary to speak English in the United States to be considered American. The likelihood that my instructional practices may include, scaffolding, linguistic support, heritage language instruction, probably not as strong, right? Like, I think those ideas are likely related. And so we've been trying to see if we could see that through this data. So we ran an exploratory factor analysis where we threw everything in. All the items from the lads, all the items from the Bali, right? And so we did the whole sample and then into our 3 categories of elementary, generalist, secondary, content teachers, and specialists. And we got 7 potential constructs that you can see here. Language and content integration, rote ideas of language, English hegemony, positioning of language learners, learning English in the US, this idea that learning English in the US is easy, that social language is important and easy, and the nature of language learning. And what is interesting to note here is 5 out of those 7 subscales in this preliminary analysis had items loading onto it that were from both the Bali and the LATs. So we're seeing some cross-loading here from the two different tools. So we're going to leave you with this. But this is still very exploratory, this work that we're doing. But our preliminary results are suggesting a relationship potentially between beliefs about language learning and sociopolitical beliefs about language. Things we're still thinking about, like, are they 2 separate constructs? About how the items are configuring. We also have like a relatively, like, 194 teachers is like good, but there are a lot of items, so we're also trying to expand that out a little bit. So we're continuing to play with our data. At the same time, we have some ongoing data collection about where we're trying to work with a more diverse range of teachers by nature, because the majority of teachers and folks in teacher preparation programs are white and monolingual. So that does, our sample does predominantly represent that. So we're trying to think about how we can also, how we can diversify our teacher pool sample by background as well. And then another thing that we've been thinking about is, the Bali is specifically about beliefs about learning like a named language. And Christina, whose background is really strong in disciplinary literacy, has like also brought in this wondering around like how beliefs about disciplinary literacy might matter, right? Like, if you believe that math is a universal language, for example, how may or may not that be related to other beliefs you have in the practices that you make? Christina, is there anything you wanted to add from our discussion?
Just that we're trying to validate the valley, which is an adventure unto itself, but I think worth sort of thinking through and doing with this sort of new audience and just to have that information. So we're hoping to get a bit more data in order to start doing some validation processes, and also use some sort of experts to help us validate sort of an updated, more modern sort of version of both of the tools.
Right. And I think we will just close here and open it up to comments and questions. Thank you, everyone, for letting us share a little bit about our work.